So in delta regions and coastal zones, a lot of the infrastructure and communities that reside there are at quite high risk, depending on what the scenario of the climate will be like. So in that sense, I think whilst there will be some losers in that sense, there might be some winners as well, because in some parts, for example, of Russia, which is incultivable, they might actually have a cultivable land, because the permafrost, which covers the land and freezes it over, will be melted for most of the years. So these countries might then have some winning factors that might really help them to capitalize on their natural resource. Obviously, this throws out of balance what is the natural inhabitants of those, let's say, ecosystems. For example, if we look at the permafrost example, there might be certain creatures that inhabit the permafrost. There might be certain natural balances that are thrown out of sync because the permafrost melts. However, if we look at it from a sense of cultivation, there could be some benefit to the country. So I think when we look at the role of technology in this space, it's very tempting to see it as a fixing solution, that we develop a technology to help in management of the risk, and then a lot of these problems could be mitigated. Of course, the scale and the type of technology, it's still, the jury is still out there on what could really work on such a large scale, because when we look at planetary alterations, the type of interventions need to be huge, really, to make that sort of balance return back in terms of the type of heat that we are generating in the planet. So when we see this Venn diagram, it actually is quite useful, because it reveals that from individual resilience to community resilience, digital engagement also is quite useful and quite helpful in that sense, because it can help really in enhancing both of these capacities. But I think it's quite critical to recall that it's not the silver bullet. It's not a quick fix solution for structural and even environmental problems. It could help in providing some respite. Like, for example, I know that some types of technologies are being used to cultivate different crops in intense heating conditions. So obviously, these type of technological interventions are extremely valuable. However, we have to then also think about the fact that accessibility may or may not exist for countries that might not be able to afford such technologies, or farmers and smallholders that cannot have access to these resources to actually know that these type of technologies even exist. Forget about sourcing them from advanced economies that might be manufacturing them. So I think it's also about understanding that technology exists in a marketplace, and that it's not something that's democratically available to all. And these are some of the bigger questions in the sector that we also need to discuss and think about as we move ahead to deal with these type of crises. And I think this also reveals that this slide here, that it's not just about complexity of systems being interconnected in countries and in different contexts, but also critical infrastructure, really, that has a lot of fine connection points and a lot of tipping balance points as well. And sometimes we don't really think too deeply about this, but it does have a sort of a knock-on effect. Like, for example, if the power is out, or if there is a major failure of a cell tower, your mobile phone will be off the grid. And this is a big challenge, because if you're not able to communicate with people easily, you might not then be able to communicate that you're safe to access news, to access resources, or even to know the whereabouts of people that you care about if there's a disaster. So this is why technology is critical, and that's where my sector of work on emergency communication preparedness, for me, is really the backbone of all of these interventions, because technology seems to be driving either more explicitly, but also implicitly, really, a lot of our life. And not just this meeting, for example, which is powered by internet and technology, but also in general, in terms of the services that we access from governments and from different service providers. So when there is a disaster situation, if that connectivity chain is broken, all of these feedback loops that you see in different lines connecting different things, they all get disturbed. And as a result, getting them back online and really servicing them is also quite challenging in a disaster scenario, because maybe some of these particular infrastructure points might be flooded, they might be seriously damaged and require a lot of effort at maintenance and restoration. So this is why a lot of government investment programs, that's why a lot of UN support is also being geared towards infrastructure resilience, because having the infrastructure able to absorb this type of shock, or anticipating risk that infrastructure might have, actually pays off a lot in terms of benefits if an actual disaster strikes. So this is why actually emergency preparedness for different types of hazards makes a difference, because the disaster, once it strikes, then the rate of return on the investment in terms of money saved, in terms of quickness in response, in terms of provision of essential services without disturbance, it's enhanced a lot. Emerging technology is actually a big interest area of the UN General Assembly, and I have been a lead author for this publication, which has been released this year by one of the Under Secretary Generals. And it reveals that there are a lot of opportunities for technologies in humanitarian and development interventions. And that's not just for those that are affected by crises, that is vulnerable populations, but it's also for people that provide humanitarian services, be they governments, be they national entities, international organizations, and so on. And as a quick glance in terms of the key opportunities for those affected, there is an access enhancement for advisory, really, information on risk, how people can prepare, access to critical assistance services, and also livelihoods. And third, for communication amongst communities. In terms of opportunities for humanitarian actors, it enhances needs analysis. So understanding what are the needs on the ground or pre-crisis, prioritizing whom requires assistance and services the first, and finally monitoring over time to understand how these pieces move and behave with each other. Another interesting report that just launched 3 days ago, and this is where I was a contributing author as well. We were trying to examine the value of democratizing technology really for emergency response and coordination, because the idea is that in the space that we are working in, a lot of our work is transforming already to digital modes. Not everyone is a coder or a developer. So a lot of technological solutions now are being designed and rolled out with a little bit more of intuitive using approaches, so that those who even have a non-technical or IT background can utilize the technology to meet the needs that they have. And often what I find, myself not being a developer, but being more on the social science spectrum of things, that when social scientists and developers work together, that's when there's a winning combination really, because developers help in developing technology to meet needs, but the needs ideally should be identified by social scientists and others in the sector directly engaging with communities and governments, so that the solution is the most fit for purpose. And the value of a solution for me is more in terms of what is it designed for. The more applicable and the more, let's say, sound the development problem is, the more appropriate and fit for purpose the technological solution will be. So I guess another point to think about is that in, let's say, a couple of years, by 2025, around 75% of the global workforce will be millennials. And many of them really very fairly proficient in the utilizations of technology for everyday life. So when we look at this bigger picture, I think the democratization of technological solutions is a good approach to adopt, even in the way that business is being done, so that we can leverage technology to meet the most goals. As I explained, I work with the Emergency Telecoms Cluster, and we do a lot of interesting work on helping communities to become more resilient to disasters by using technologies. My work is oriented more for national governments. And I have a lot of interesting work experiences, which I will try to give you some case studies from to highlight the applicability of these concepts. The idea is that when we think about preparedness for response, we need to understand that people, process, and technology sort of exist in a continuum. Like if we look at it like a triangle, and if one leg of the triangle is not sound, the structure will collapse. So a lot of this testing and understanding whether country protocols are actually working well are through simulation exercises. So I've been going also physically back in the days before COVID restricted the movements to various countries all over the world to run emergency simulations with them and to test really the protocols and simulate a disaster scenario. So understanding really how governments are responding to crises, how they coordinate with each other, what are the gaps, challenges, and blocks. And this way, a lot of issues are ironed out before a real disaster strikes. Another dimension is readiness assessments. So a lot of governments need support really to identify how ready they are to respond to crises. So in these cases, for example, in one day, I'm actually going to go to the Dominican Republic, which is a Latin American country, but it's sort of in the Caribbean bloc near the Caribbean islands, where I will run a similar assessment there to understand how their infrastructure, policies, personnel, but also their overall environment is ready for different types of crises, because that country is very, very vulnerable to hurricanes, floods, and storm surges. So these assessments help in understanding a little bit more of country-specific needs and requirements. And another area which I can share is very recent experience. As you can see, this was taken in Madagascar, where I was present a couple of weeks ago. And it was a very exciting opportunity to be there, helping the government to devise their emergency planning, really, to be able to respond to these type of crises, because they also have a high vulnerability to cyclones and are very vulnerable to very serious disaster events. And another, I guess, few countries where a similar approach has been adopted, and they're quite different if you think about it, are Bhutan, Mozambique, Mongolia. And these countries each have their own needs and requirements really for planning for crises. But I guess all of them are acting in an anticipatory manner, because they understand that having the disaster strike is really more costly than investing in emergency preparedness. And the technology really helps them to understand in terms of early warning when a disaster is coming, in terms of emergency response coordination, to be able to speak quickly with different stakeholders on digital platforms. And then finally, of course, to also help in the country coming back on its feet once the disaster strikes. Finally, there are just a few more case studies, and I'm coming towards the end very quick. Another element is that there is a bit of a challenge in really understanding risk and assessing these type of risks. So some of the past work is also covered a stepwise process for assessment of different climate risks. And these approaches are very interesting because it's not just about a traditional risk assessment, but it also has a socio-economic dimension. So understanding the vulnerability of the country in terms of its social and economic situation, that also feeds into its overall risk sensitivity, if you will call it that way. And these approaches really help countries to position themselves and also see in this stepwise process, where are they really lacking, what are opportunities for enhancement, and also perhaps opportunities for partnering with international entities for technical support. And finally, another area which I could share as a fairly good example is different instruments really which help in enhancing country understanding of the value of risk management, and also help in keeping countries on track in terms of global commitments. Because there are these global frameworks that exist, as I showed in the first slide. There are a lot of commitments that exist within those frameworks, but having policy instruments really helps. And this is another policy instrument that I was sort of the lead drafter of, and it was adopted in Mongolia at an Asian ministerial conference for disaster risk reduction. So, having all the countries really deliberate, agree with this instrument and come up with the language, it's quite a difficult process, really. And I think it being a part of intergovernmental negotiations, at least from my experience, what I've understood is that it's not that straightforward as one would like. Like, one would like to propose, like, okay, everybody must do such and such, but in a democratic way, for countries to themselves agree to proposals and to own the proposal as theirs, that's actually the most powerful type of policy intervention. Not one that is imposed, but one that is actually proposed and owned. And this is where a lot of movement in policy is quite slow, and often it takes a bit of time and advocacy really to build up those messages. However, the promising news is that with this climate issue that's burning, really, literally, a lot of countries and governments are accelerating their preparedness at an unforeseen rate. And this I can also attest to from the fact that a lot more government demands are coming on our side as well, a lot more interesting opportunities of work, but also there's a lot more ownership. And so I think that's quite promising as well for how things will look like in the future. I'm going to present the poll. It's the same code as before. If you refresh the screen that you were on, the new poll will show up as what's the future for tech and resilient community development. So you can enter a word or whatever response you have as you did the last time. Okay, yeah, that's very fair. Yes, definitely. Equitability and inclusivity, it sort of goes hand in hand. Yes, and I think this innovation point is quite interesting as well, because innovation is also a function of the environment. There needs to be support in terms of finance, incubation facilities, ability really to develop those innovative solutions, which in certain advanced economies is more readily available because they have more public finance, expenditure programs, talent development and R&D and so on. So this is quite critical. Yes, more coordination for sure amongst different sectors as well. Combination with education, because community really needs to be aware of these issues. In many communities, there is not an understanding also of what risks they face. So how are they supposed to prepare if they don't have risk information? And when you think of communication, it's also about, this climate change education, really, like education in disaster and climate, which really democratizes these terms and makes it really digestible. Because if you just think of terms like planetary limits, nobody really understands what that means unless they've studied it. So I think these kind of things are quite critical. And it's interesting to see education is coming up to be one of the top ones. And I would say that space is really needing a lot more intervention in terms of communicators that can actually carry forward these messages in following the science, of course. So it has to be accurate in following science, but democratizing the density around the terminologies. So using terms and words really that are inclusive to people so that they can understand easily. I would agree with that as well. Downscaling, yes, that's an interesting one. Balance technology with access, for sure. I think access issues are very critical. And that's also a big part of the job that I do, is that in places where there is zero or no access, we try to make conditions for access. And I have to say, it's not an easy task, but I think it's something that is quite, I'm not really sure in terms of e-commerce how it means so, but maybe, somebody who wrote e-commerce, could you share your perspective so that the group can know a bit more? If you feel comfortable to share, if you feel a bit on the spot, don't worry about it. Okay, I think we're at a static stage now. So it seems like we have more or less the understanding. But as you can see, this is quite interesting also to understand amongst yourselves what the perspectives are on this topic and what are the key themes that have emerged. So with that, let me close this poll. Thank you. That's all from my side.